Thank you, John. And welcome, Paul. I'm delighted to have persuaded Paul to give up some of his time to come talk to us about what has become the center of the national conversation: police reform, what's going on with police departments, what's this call about defunding police departments. And so I'm just very pleased that Paul, you were able to join. If you look at the conversation that's going on today, you've got Gavin Newsom, our governor, calling for new restrictions on crowd control techniques, prohibition on carotid holds, Mayor Breed hosting a panel discussion. I'm sure you're very aware of that. Oakland, San Jose, Berkeley, Santa Clara, and also beyond California. This has become a critical issue. And let me introduce Paul's background here. We've got this is great. We've got a superstar for one of our last speakers here. He's spent his entire professional career working in public service for the city of San Francisco. He spent from 1995 to 2010, he was chief of administration and was a prosecutor for the prior district attorney in San Francisco, Kamala Harris, now of course Senator Harris. He then spent 7 years as the deputy chief of staff and public safety director to the former mayor, Ed Lee. And then he was tapped for the appointment as the director of the Department of Police Accountability. Interestingly, the Police Accountability Department is relatively new, and I'm going to ask you about this, Paul, in terms of how it morphed from what was then known as the Office of Citizen Complaints and become DPA. But Paul, again, welcome to the program, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. Super excited to talk to all of the young, brilliant minds entering this lovely profession. So yeah, thank you for that great introduction. I'm so excited that you guys are here and stuck listening to me. I love a captive audience where people can't escape. So it's wonderful to have the focus talk about some of the things that I care deeply about.
What I want to do is just ask you, first of all, and I'm going to let's turn this over to you and the fellows to have more of a free-form conversation. But what is how do you speak to this issue of this tension between the police department and the rank and file? They don't really want the department. Well, I'm going to say this is overbroad, but there's some resistance that you face, do you not, in terms of coming in and investigating from a civilian oversight perspective?
Yeah, and I think that's an understatement, right? Like it's a pretty, it's an adversarial relationship for the most part, unnecessarily, but it just is what it is. I think change is really difficult, and I think the preconceived notions that parties bring to the table exacerbates the problems being worked out easily or facilitating change. And so at every opportunity, there are oftentimes what I would call ridiculous measures and positions taken that don't need to take place. I think what's really interesting, I always just look at everything from like an intellectual approach or a 5,000 foot approach, is the shift in relationship and the shift in interpretation from me specifically in my leadership at DPA as it relates to not just the police who don't act independently, but from the POA and their union specifically, and how much that shapes and colors the day-to-day interactions involving my agency and the people that are working here with the police department. So
I was going to ask you, today in the Chronicle, I'm sure you saw the article, the headline is, while some California police unions promise change, others seek to undo reforms. And right. So this is this is right in the front page of the Chronicle today, is about this issue about police unions either partnering or resisting. Speak to that, if you will, about how we deal with that from your perspective, and because that's going to be a real issue, right? You've got labor unions that are trying to protect their measures and they're fighting back, and how do we get around that?
I don't know that you get around them, and I don't know that the fight is going to go away. And in some levels, I would say that the fight is escalating. And so let me contextualize that. I feel like this drifts into the issue of the defund the police, and then it drifts into a lot of the civil unrest that's going on as well. But let's just focus now on your specific question about the unions. And I think that it is fair, and I think that these questions and challenges to and with the union are very specific and precise. And I think even without a purposeful or an intentional directed challenge to the unions, generally the conversations have shifted to include unions in ways that they have not in the past. And I think it's really important now that communities, specifically communities of color, are starting to parse out their focus beyond just demand for justice, right? Beyond just the conflict that this country has been in for decades about reforming race disparate outcomes that involve the police department. So tying that to the union specifically, I think it always has been and is now a more clear question to challenge and ask about what the role of those unions have been. Certainly workers are always entitled to have strong representation on behalf of their unions, but the unique thing as it relates to police conduct and as it relates to policing and public safety is, I think, falls into two specific categories with the unions. Has your work on behalf of those unions, has your advocacy on behalf of the police departments, has the money that you have collected and spent on behalf of those law enforcement agencies done one of two things? Has it stood in the way of progress and reform? Have you taken positions that have stymied, blocked, hindered, removed, or gutted reforms as they've come up in the past? And then secondarily, and this gets a little into the weeds and is more of an esoteric conversation, but have you worked on behalf of those union members to perpetuate transgressions and problems? And that's an important issue to raise, because separate from what you do related to the reforms, once individuals have been identified with clear transgressions and problems, has the union played an active role either in protecting those jobs so that they remain and stay in the positions that they're in, or in shielding those individuals to allow them to transfer from one city to another, one county to another, one position to another? And it turns into like a whack-a-mole. So to the degree you have resolved a problem, addressed a problem, prosecuted a case, challenged an individual, does that individual pop up somewhere else in a similar role as a sheriff still carrying a gun? Does he end up in a desk position doing something still on the force where public dollars, public tax dollars are paying for the perpetuation of outcomes that they don't want? And I think, and you didn't ask me this, but I'm on a roll, so you're going to get it. I think like right now, we are at a new place. We are at a crossroads where we are evaluating law enforcement differently. It is no longer an adoptive admission that we need police in the same way if that adoptive admission comes with a package of race disparities that we are not willing to look at, we're not willing to talk about, we're not willing to fix. And that's why I think we're at a very different place right now. And I think the union has some very difficult questions to ask. And I think it's raising a lot of the issues specifically in talking about those unions is how well funded they are. And then as a related issue, how well funded are these law enforcement agencies as well? I mean, in most cities, their singular largest expense is public safety. And it's not education, it's not housing, it's not services. And I think these are fair questions to ask from communities, especially communities of color, to be asking these questions and addressing budget in new ways. And that's why I think we're at a crossroads in a watershed moment where everything is back on the table. I don't know how it's going to be sorted out, but I'm very clear on what the questions are. And the distinction being made right now are conversations like this, where an entire audience is having a conversation and walks away from that conversation better informed as to the internal and esoteric operations of how law enforcement works, how budgets work, how they're all tied together, how unions that represent law enforcement agencies work, the possibility of civilian oversight, the possibility for change and evolution. All of that is crucially important.
I did want to get into the defunding controversy.
But
before we do that, a few more questions, and I really want to let the participants here ask questions, and I don't want to take up all the time. But you raised an issue that's part of the debate now, and that is police officers who commit misconduct move on to another department. And I think you said whack-a-mole, because then the problem comes up again.
I think there is a solution to deal with that. And I think those are conversations that at least I'm a part of right now, and it's taking place because heretofore we haven't had experts at the table willing to raise or address those issues that shine the light on some of these subjective and intransigent decisions that get made behind closed doors, that unless you are a legal authority that is not just a smart lawyer, but also familiar with how law enforcement agencies work and the extra layer and set of laws and protections that no other profession have dealing with COBRA. And like, you know, in California has some of the strongest protections in the United States, specifically for law enforcement. But, you know, these aren't generally understood concepts, nor are they generally conversations that a lot of people have. I wish there were classes being taught and, you know, in our law schools on public safety and law enforcement issues as it relates to the law. If it does, I'm willing to come because I have a lot to say. There is a song in my heart. I am ready for you. But these are things that are now on the table to be addressed and talked about in entirely new ways. But those issues, those protections, those privileges, and that's only one of them. There's so many more of them, and I'll leave you with this one just in answer to your question. It's the same thing of when you see officers charged with crimes and they are given the benefit of the doubt from 12 strangers to evaluate and be deferential to law enforcement to see if they get charged with crimes. Whereas if you and I are charged with a crime or commit a crime, an elected or appointed leader exercises their prosecutorial discretion to determine that we may face charges. Like that distinction in and of itself are some of the privileges that come along with a job that's being, I think, re-examined in a new way. And we have to answer more specific questions, but we're absolutely entitled as a community, and we're absolutely entitled to voters and taxpayers to question what those decisions are from our law enforcement agencies, and to question what those decisions are as it relates to our appointed and elected officials and the spectrum of how law enforcement is handled. And I would say that it goes beyond that. We have a broader duty to re-examine and look at our judicial system as well. The disparities are from the beginning of the pipeline to the end of the pipeline. If we could remove race disparities from our criminal justice system today, the prison population would go down more than 40%. 40%. That's how much the disparity exists, compounded by arrest, by use of force, by sentencing disparities. The sentencing disparities alone, if there is a person of color versus a person not of color with the exact same fact pattern, the sentencing rate is still 20% higher for people of color. We have to arm ourselves, and I'm big on this. You don't have to agree with what I have to say, although you should, because I'm really smart and I know what the hell I'm talking about. But you don't have to believe me. You don't have to like me. You don't have to love what I have to say, but these are just facts. And you don't get to argue with my facts. Here they are. So let's talk about them. And I don't want to hear your aspirational objectives any longer about, we just want justice. We just want peace. No, I want you to address use of force race disparities that's 19.3 times higher for the rest of the population. Talk about that. You have it, it exists. What are you going to do about it? I know you don't know. Here's some examples. I mean, we can't demand those conversations. We can't move in that direction until we all participate and we all have a role to do that as well. I would say, and again, I know this isn't part of the question, but for me, from while I was in law school, and I felt literally every single day felt like a new revelation. And part of what drove me to law school was feeling like things happen to my community rather than for my community. I grew up here in San Francisco. I'm a fourth generation San Franciscan. My mother was a public defender, and I went to the DA's office. Obviously, no one celebrated that in my household, and nobody was excited. But I wanted to be in a role and in a seat in making decisions about making changes. And that seemed important to me. And then more importantly, I also really valued and cared about the highest measurement of race disparities in our justice system, in our criminal justice system, was the disproportionate rate of victims for communities of color, and who is their voice, who speaks for them, who defines what justice looks like for them. I thought that was important. I came. But while I was in law school, and if we're honest, I really also wanted to make some money, because I knew if you got to be a lawyer that you could pay off those student loans. I don't know about all of you, but I had these things called student loans where they loan you money to go to school and then you have to pay it back. So, but while I was in school, literally every day felt like a revelation of, oh my gosh, that's how contracts work? Oh my gosh, that's what a tort is? Wow, this is how people win lawsuits. This is how the law works, that shapes, excludes, marginalizes, harms, diminishes communities of color or people that have experiences like me into these red line districts or rules that prevent them from being successful. It felt to me like more of a calling to become a fierce advocate and to find a passion and focus it. And literally at the end of the day, I think that is the key to finding your success. I work a lot, but it doesn't feel like work because I literally care about whatever people put in front of me and want to take action on it.
And just in terms of the debate that's going on, there's one narrative that there's systemic racism throughout the police department or departments. That's one narrative. The other narrative is, no, you actually have a lot of people who are trying to do their job. They're well-intentioned. It's a tough job. Very few people want to do it, but there are some bad apples. And you have to get rid of the, quote, bad apples.
I think there are good people that are officers, and that is a hard job. It is a very difficult job to do. And there are bad apples. I reject the conversation, though, of it's a they're just some bad apples, because I think it's too simplistic a view to address the real problems and doesn't speak to the systemic changes that need to take place and the problems with the structure and the general approach to policing. But let me put that on this table for a second, and let's talk about just the bad apples and why I reject that qualification that is so frequently used as a defense to policing. To the degree there are bad apples in a department, and there are. Have you ever had a bad apple? It's disgusting. It's gross. There might be a bug in it. It tastes nasty. But what does that bad apple leave you with? The next time someone offers you an apple and it's shiny, or they tell you, I'm going to give you an apple, your first thought is, no, thank you. I'm good on apples. I'm good. No, I don't want that apple. So there is a problem in a lasting impression that a bad apple leaves on the entire universe of the policing that I don't think ever really gets addressed. And that's part of the problem. You don't get to isolate it in your mind academically once you've had that experience. And those experiences are broader and more direct in terms of the exposure to the bad apples when you come from the communities of color. And like one of the things I always like to talk about when I give these presentations is being detained and arrested, or had use of force used on me, for example, at least 8 times, at least. Where in look, see, and now judgment. I see all of this in you. I haven't done any of those things, but I've been detained and arrested in ways that were unfair and uncivil. Uh, the first time was in high school. My mother refused to represent me, which was a whole another long therapy session that I'll explain later. But she wanted me to see what it was like to not have access to legal support and for me to defend myself. So I had to go on my own to the Youth Guidance Center to fight my case and to show and prove that, I went to fancy high school here, St. Ignatius. There were 5 Black people. I was one of them. So to be arrested in an audience and an environment like that was really frustrating to me, but it was a good life lesson for me. The last time I was arrested was at gunpoint from from a group of officers while I was chief prosecutor for the city. And the officer I actually knew, thank God, because he was like, oh no, I know him. He's an assistant. I'm in a suit. Ridiculous. But of course I fit a description. I only tell you these stories because I like to quantify the conversation, because I think people see me, or they see my titles, or they see my background and experience, and they feel like, well, not him. I think people get stopped that are like, fill in the blank. But that doesn't matter when you look like me or you come from a community of color and your very presence is seen as a weapon in some circumstances, which again doesn't speak to all officers, but speaks to bad cops making bad judgments and bad decisions without repercussions. That leads us to the second thing, which is the systemic nature of the problem, which doesn't get addressed and is perpetuated by how policing is done and the excuses or defenses that are built in currently into what policing looks like right now, where there isn't the same level of accountability for those bad experiences with the bad apples that the public would expect. And so for the past few months, I think these issues have been exacerbated by folks being at home with COVID and watching TV. And while they're watching TV and reading things in the media, they're seeing all of these terrible narratives in the media that are taking place. And there has been a growing sense that this level of frustration can't be tolerated, that we can't accept a justice system with 2 separate levels of justice, one for communities of color and then one for everyone else. And so that's why I think we've come to this big crossroads of a new understanding and awareness for a fight that has gone on for decades with communities of color, where people are now better informed and are demanding not just change, action.
This does seem like that there's a special time. This is a special time, and whereas in the past there have been controversial things that have happened and people think there's going to be change, it's died for whatever reasons. But I think this could be different. But let me ask you about this defunding movement, if you will. And I was in a protest over the weekend in Oakland, and there was people carrying placards, defund the police. And you and I had a conversation about this briefly, where my initial reaction is, you can't defund the police. That makes no sense at all. In fact, you probably should put more money into the police department in order to get more civilians on the street, get better training, get better candidates. That costs money. But then you push back and said, well, nobody's talking about defunding the police. That's just an overbroad statement. Speak to that, if you will, in terms of what does defund the police mean? Because clearly we need police, right? I mean, there is a function in society for police.
Defunding the police specifically means that right now, and again, this is almost like the perfect storm of COVID and the return to work coming at the same time, that budget talks are at the forefront of every single municipality, and specifically public safety budget concerns as it relates to how cities are responding and reacting to the rallies, the protests, even the riots that are taking place throughout this nation, and the cost of what policing looks like. Couple that with the newly declared recession for this country, it's raised the issue of what is the credible approach to funding police in the ways that we have, that is more of a perpetuation and almost a rubber stamp in the past to those agencies without safeguards. Because I think the conversation about defunding the police is the recognition that we have a duty to stop law enforcement from doing what's wrong, that's just as important as demanding that they do what's right. Ooh, that was a good tweet. Just that was a good tweet. You're going to see that anyway. But I think that's the. But I think that that's really important, and I think that that's what's behind the movement. And depending on who you ask, and part of why I have done so much news and press about that issue is I have such a visceral reaction. It makes me very angry when we see the explanation from the media, or we're watching the news and they go and talk to some random idiot in a parking lot at the grocery store, and they're like, defund the police, what does it mean to you? And they give an inarticulate answer that, it's very frustrating and there's anger behind it, but doesn't speak to what decision makers are evaluating when they are contemplating what the movement means. And it gives people a back door to not fully understand. Because I will tell you what defund the police means. Defund the police means approaching your budget to make sure that what you're paying money for is going to give you what society wants and what your communities want and what voters want and what taxpayers want. And that's what defund the police is. Now, it could be we don't want police and we want to reform policing. And if you pay attention to what some of the big cities are saying, including San Francisco, like Los Angeles, like New York, like Chicago, they're saying they're reforming the police. This is happening in Minneapolis as well, and in Minnesota. They're saying they've reformed their police station. Now, those are just buzzwords to address, I think, the needs and the calls from community, because their reformation of the police department doesn't mean that they're getting a whole new police department. It just means that they're going to speak to some of these problems that we're raising. I think at the center of that conversation is community policing. I mean, not just community policing, an adoption of more community policing, but the civilian oversight. I mean, we already know that that speaks to best practices as it relates to policing, to try and have a more neutral and judicious outcome from the policing. But it's such a small part of the conversation that's growing now. We have between 17 and 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and there are just over 200 civilian agencies. The majority of them are not formed with the necessary subpoena power. And what we have here in San Francisco is the Lieberger waivers, meaning you don't get the protection of self-incrimination to not testify. So if my agency subpoenas you, you must talk or you lose your job. And that's part of your employment contract. Those are really important tools in order to do this job well. I think, and again, this is in the weeds, but if you look at a lot of these other agencies that are struggling, most of them are struggling because they are, I don't want to call them fake, I just want to say that they're challenged. So they'll either put on a group of community members to do this job, and it's very complicated to do, because if you don't have access and do independent investigations, your entire job is structured reviewing the same reports that the department that you're supposed to be reviewing gives you. And that's all you have. That's tough to do. And in the majority of those agencies, it's unpaid. So you're already talking about a voluminous amount of work that is structured. They just paper you to death. And trying to navigate all of that without specific training, either from legal training or criminal justice training, to do all of that. It just makes it very hard, especially if you're not going to be paid and you don't have individual autonomous investigations, if you don't have subpoena power so you can force people to talk to you or bring in witnesses. And also if you can't have forced or compelled statements to get some of the work done. So.
Well, there's just lots to talk about here.
I know, I'm sorry. I'm trying to fit it all in life.
No, but I love your idea of the dialogue being important and setting the foundation for real change, because on the example of community policing, what a lot of departments did, and when that became sort of a buzz phrase, we need community policing, they would hire police officers that were the community police officers, and then they had other officers who were not community police
Correct.
officers, right. which is absurd. But with that, I want to turn this over to allow the fellows and your interns to ask questions.
Good afternoon. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. You talked a little bit about how you felt like this moment needs to go beyond just general calls for justice. And I think in the conversation, there's sort of a nuanced difference between accountability and then systemic change. And so those solutions might look differently, like what it means to get accountability or justice for somebody that's been harmed by the police is different than how to change the police. So it's focusing more on how to change the police and sort of is there something from your perspective that you'd like to see people that are protesting or are talking to their city council people across the nation, something that you see could really change the police, not just, general calls for justice? You talked a little bit about civilian oversight. So is there something else?
Yeah, so there's a whole spectrum of those things, and they're all equally important. And honestly, just because you raised it, my expectation is every single time I speak to an audience, I fully expect that I hope that one person or that everyone walks away feeling like, oh, I hadn't thought about it like that. Or like, oh, yeah, I think that is right. And that they lend their voice to the broader movement of, had you thought about this? Or did you know this? Or I talked to this guy and he told me this. And it doesn't have to be me. I always try and encourage people, if you find someone that resonates with you, that you get, follow that person on social media, join them on LinkedIn, follow up to see where their ideas are and co-opt them, steal them for your own to share with them and disseminate them, because none of these solutions are going to get fixed. And I think they've been perpetuated so long because people haven't really understood them, and they're too complicated in terms of the defenses for movement to take place in order for it to happen. But let me go back and answer your question directly. The key to all of this, in my opinion, is data. We have to have evidence-based solutions. Again, so you don't have to believe me, but you have to believe your stats. And it's no longer acceptable that, oh, well, we don't collect those stats. Collect them. And now that you've collected them, because this is where we are in a number of counties in California, we collect them. There's a 96A report that talks about race disparities, but we don't know how to analyze them. We don't know what to do with them. That is the key. You have to start with that. If you don't know anything about policing anywhere and you're in Fresno, question number one is, do we collect data? Is it transparent? Let me download it. Let me look at it. I see on page 13, why are these individuals stopped more frequently? Answer that question. And it's not okay to just say, I don't know. You have to know, because someone is having these experiences and we're paying for it. So I would say the key to all of this is data, transparency, and analysis for that data. And the other things are bigger issues, but that's so much the cornerstone of it that it needs to get done. I think a lot of that approach and a lot of that focus can be done easily and in an informed way from having civilian oversight. And like I said, I'm not denigrating the other forms of civilian oversight that exist, but having something is better than nothing. And at least it starts raising the issues and sharing the information with a broader audience that I think is more important. So I do think beyond just the data analysis, collection, transparency, is the creation of civilian oversight agencies. And you should be asking in your counties and your cities, what is our civilian oversight agency? How do they operate? What is their jurisdiction? How does that work? And then I think just getting into the weeds, just to give you some low-hanging fruit of things that I think are outcome determinative for this bigger issue is use of force. Most jurisdictions have such outdated use of force policies, and that's why you see so many of these problems that we're seeing throughout this country, where while use of force has changed in terms of best practices, so many cities, the majority of them, have not updated their use of force policies and are still using policies that are up to 3 decades old. So that's why you see that in some counties, police are shooting at cars, that they're using the knee on the neck restraint techniques, that they're still using no-knock warrants that have been proven and shown to be a higher risk of execution. And now they're subjectively being used with communities of color. And those are the examples that we see in the news, because it's still allowed, but they're subjectively used in a way that has not been race neutral. And so that, you know what I mean? Like, once we are informed with all of this stuff, it's easy to write your letter to the mayor. It's easy to attend a police commission meeting. It's easy to go to your local law enforcement agency. And I keep saying law enforcement agency because I don't want to get distracted from, like, well, it's just the police. No, it's still the sheriff as well. And it's, you know, it's called whatever it's called and however your county is structured, but the questions are still the same that we need to be asking them. What does oversight look like? What has been your discipline process? Do you have an updated use of force policy? Let me see it. Do you collect data? Do you analyze data? Are there race neutral outcomes in your use of force? I keep saying in use of force because generally, no matter where I go, what I do, where I begin that conversation, that is the highest record of race disparities that we can start with. And of course, that's a difficult problem to challenge, but it's clarity that there is a problem here. Most often when I'm talking, people say, we don't have those problems in Ohio. No, you don't have those problems in Ohio. If I go and speak to the broader community, if I talk to the Muslim community, if I talk to the Latinx community, if I talk to the LGBT community, if I talk to the Black and brown communities, wherever, I'm getting a very different story. And it really is a separate track of justice, a separate track of experiences that is just not acceptable in this day and age. And that's why we're having this conversation.
Hello. So I'm wondering, in an effort to sort of restructure or refinance municipal budgets, say in the near future, say police budgets are decreased again in our near future. I'm wondering, in your opinion, what would be the best way to utilize that money that would have formerly gone to the police department?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that's a case-by-case basis based on what's going on in the department. Now, in my opinion, it should be a non-race neutral kind of analysis, like what departments have been paying and not being served by the race disparities, and let's put a thumb on the discretion to address, service, or benefit the communities that have suffered at the hands of the system that's been perpetuated by these systems throughout the years. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean reparations, but if I get a check for reparations, I'm going to cash it. I'm just saying that we should have a conversation that talks about, because I think you can have this conversation. Oftentimes I get backed into a corner when I get into these debates and they say, like, this is just the affirmative action and you just want to give the money to Black people. Listen, we can take that all off the table and just talk about economics. We can have a socioeconomic disparities discussion, and it's the exact same thing. So let's shift those money and those dollars into where the broadest socioeconomic needs are. And then that does the exact same thing and helps the general public. And you don't ever have to use the word race in there. I'm just saying the discretion, the bad discretion and the bad attention and the bad outcomes that have been focused with a level of an adopted attentionality by not fixing these issues so far has harmed and diminished specific communities. Why can't we talk about it since they were the ones that have been most harmed? But if you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to, and we can shift that solution to talk about some of the more difficult and intransigent problems that we have in society and that we have in cities, to focus on education, to focus on housing, and to focus on economic opportunities. Those are the three that I would start on. And then when we talk about economic opportunities, I would really focus on some of the reentry issues too, because I think that scoops up a lot of problems that people don't like talking about. And most cities, when I talk and meet with them, really have a sense and a perception that folks that are coming in and through the criminal justice system, they come and then they go away. And, most people, the average prison sentence is 4 to 6 years. And so we don't have a real sense of what happens to those folks, right? They don't get out of prison and move to Australia, right? They come right back to these same communities, and now they come back with restrictions on housing, with restriction on education, with restriction to benefits. And it's all of these things that for a city like San Francisco, we're talking about almost 1,500 people a year. And what are we doing now as a society? I think we're at a new place where we can't afford to throw away those growing resources that are untapped and unutilized by society. And it exacerbates the problems that we have with housing. It exacerbates the problems that we have with homelessness. And that's a whole nother seminar and lecture, but that's the answer. Okay, sorry. I am gonna get faster. Normally this conversation on race and disparities is literally like a 4 to 6 hour seminar that I give at the school. So it's, I'm trying to bundle it all up and just say it all. I'm doing it like it's TV, like you get little sound bites of everything. But I apologize, because otherwise it would be a much more thorough and much more in-depth analysis where I can prove my arguments or show more of this with the facts and the data and examples with specific cities. And so I know I'm rushing it and weaving in and out of these things and talking too long, but I just wanted to explain it.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Your answers are super informative, so I really appreciate that. My question is, we just had a session a little while earlier about the complexities of unions and collective bargaining. So I wanted to ask you, how do you kind of envision this kind of inevitable push and pull between the public demanding, defunding and looking at the allocation of the budget, and then we have the cities implementing reforms, but then we have these really strong police labor unions and agreements, and they have to kind of
agree.
They're here talking about their measures. So how do you kind of envision this kind of playing out in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it is kind of complicated because you have to push on one to pull on another. And the cities generally don't have direct interaction like that with the unions to make those broad and sweeping changes that might be easier if the unions weren't actively working to dismantle, prevent, block, or delay those changes when they get made.
How can the communities kind of address this concept of the blue wall when trying to have these discussions about reform and, holding these bad apples accountable? Because in New York, we saw, when that man was pushed down, we saw the 57 resign from the riot unit in that instance. And like last night and in this morning today, we saw on Twitter the blue flu trending, where officers in Atlanta were calling out sick and things like that. So how can we have these kinds of meaningful discussions and actually create meaningful change when we're having these kind of instances where people are kind of trying to push a certain narrative about the situation?
Yeah, I think the changes start with us, right? I always like to personalize it, right? It's not like, don't let me forget, and we're going to come to this, vote, right? Like we have to the degree we care, we have to vote on elected officials that hear, know, and understand the things that we're talking about. But I think change is personal. And so I am not comfortable waiting for this current administration to take up the cry on my behalf and make changes, especially given the fact that this administration specifically has reduced the agency that is charged with oversight for police and law enforcement practices by more than half. Now, we're not talking about that. We haven't had discussions about that. Why has the current administration shrunk the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to less than half of what it was from the last from the last administration, and that's the department charged with police reforms. It's not a mistake that we're having a proliferation of these conversations now, where we're having incidents happen all over the place in a bad way, because the approach from the current administration has been to address these transgressions individually. But doing that doesn't speak to the pattern and practice process that goes on throughout this country, so that when you fix no-knock warrants in Texas, you still have you can't jog in Atlanta, and you still have bad arrests in Michigan, and you still have whatever you have, because you're not looking at a systemic issue with that approach. I think rather than waiting and hoping and taking a precatory approach towards change with policing and public safety in general, we have to start individually and ask ourselves now, what can I do today? How do I have those conversations? I think it begins with educating yourself more about what that process is. These are the things when you hear and you see, and again, it doesn't have to be me, although I am a really good one. But when you hear and see these folks, you know, you should say, put this person on the faculty, bring this person to speak. I want them at my auntie's book club. I want to hear what they have to say. I'm going to repost that on my Instagram post. I'm going to put this on my Facebook, because we can't expect others to care more about these issues than we do. But if we're not vocal about what our positions are, it's an adoptive admission that perpetuates the same problem. It's no longer okay to say that I wish that there was reform. Like, if you believe that, then you have to say it. We have to tell our friends, we have to tell our neighbors, we have to tell our families what our beliefs are and articulate them so that they feel supported and we feel supported. And when we have an informed position and we talk to law enforcement, I like to just make it personal. And, you know, I'm a lawyer, so I always want to argue everything. It's like, this doesn't have to be a debate. You're not entitled to just be wrong, because these are facts. Oh, you didn't know? Let me show you. Here they are. What about this? And I know these are hard conversations. They are. They really are. Nobody wants to admit to be racist. Well, there's some people that do, but the most people don't want to admit that they are racist. But it's not a matter of you being racist. It's a matter of how are you either silent or perpetuating a racist system or these racist outcomes. And you don't get to argue with me about whether or not that's true. And I don't want to hear your anecdotal evidence about that's never happened to my dry cleaners and he's black. I don't care about that. That is just your story. Here are the statistics. Here's what's going on in your city and in your town. What do you think about that? What do you think you could do? Because I've got some ideas for what you could do. If you are an officer, you should say it. And I've got a lot of friends that are police officers. You know, I spent the majority of my time as a prosecutor. I worked a lot with the police, and I know some of them are really good, and I know a lot of them work really hard, but that doesn't mean that's not enough right now. If you can't recognize that there are intransigent problems with policing that create, conflate, and perpetuate race disparities, that's where we have a problem. That's another good tweet, by the way. But those are the conversations. So when I talk to officers and they're like, it's not me, I'm not saying it's you, but your silence to change things isn't enough. And this perspective of folks not willing to say or do something, even when they know of wrongdoing, I doubt that you don't know of wrongdoing. I doubt that you don't see the subjective race disparities in policing that are taking place every day. The issue is, how can I support you in making those changes? And I can support you better if you're honest and open about what you've seen and what you do and how those processes are built and how we can change them. That's the conversation. And again, not to publicly shame any individual, but the facts do speak for themselves. I know you didn't do it, but part of what we're seeing and part of why we're having this backlash about the thin blue line is because in a lot of these videos and big notorious cases that we're seeing a whole gaggle of other officers watching these ridiculous and heinous videos and not taking action. And I think it's a fair discussion to talk about that. How are you being trained, and how comfortable would you be in blowing the whistle and saying that you feel uncomfortable and intervening when you see the subjective use of force being misapplied for communities of colors in ways that you don't see in other communities. That's a fair conversation. And I think having the conversation changes people. I literally believe that hearing the words, facing the issues, and enlightening yourself as to what the actual issues are, right? Beyond just the rage. And this is why it's really important to me to have conversations like this. It's not just, I know individual X is angry, but articulate your anger and tie it to specifics, tie it to facts, tie it to challenges and problems that are more palatable. And quite frankly, that's our job. That's why we went to law school. We are advocates, we are trained, we are strong communicators, but tying our strong, bring to the table what you can. I am not ever going to be at a big firm doing appellate review and sitting in the library writing some elaborate things. Now, don't get me wrong, I can write, but it takes me longer to write. I am more of a water cooler kind of guy. Let me go and build out some client base. Let me talk and explain to you what the firm really is trying to do. Let me tell you what this issue really is. And you are arming yourselves every single day with the education that you have. We are so special right now. And I think you miss the opportunity as law students to recognize just how special you are. There's less than 1% of this entire nation has an advanced degree. And you don't perceive how special you are because, well, everybody's in law school. No, just your friends are in law school, the people you're surrounding yourself with. But it is such an empowering position to be in, to have the education that you have. I think it's just our obligation to use that. People listen to you, people look to you, people will follow you just because you got into law school, just because you participated in a program like this, just because you have access to folks like John and Arthur or myself and Willie Brown or whomever. It is your obligation to be informed, and it's more your obligation to connect the dots for broader communities and your own communities to make sure that they learn, know, hear, and appreciate what you're learning and sharing it with them.
I'm actually gonna take the liberty of asking a question, even though there are other people queued up here.
Yeah.
But I'm curious on one of the questions that was asked, and I think it was your intern got into the issue.
And that wasn't a plan. I didn't tell her to ask a question.
Yeah. It was about the police unions, and I'm curious as to your thoughts of the backdrop with the police union spending money to defeat candidates they think are a problem.
A lot.
They went after George Gascon here. They're going after George Gascon in the Los Angeles DA's race. I think the LIPPL has put like millions into
correct.
And then Chesa Boudin, another example. They spent how much money trying to defeat him? But there's a First Amendment problem here, right? Can you selectively say, don't spend that money there, you can only spend it for something else? And how do you, to me, that's a real problem.
So two things, and I think that this in part speaks to the answer that Athena had asked, which was, what can we do? I think we can ask officers, what are your dollars being spent for? Is this what your leadership looks like? Why are you, well, first let's talk about how the dollars are being spent, right? They absolutely are in specific instances, right? I can't speak for every single union throughout this country, but there are specific instances where generally the dollars are spent to protect law enforcement in ways that block, hinder, or obstruct justice reforms. And that's just an absolute. And we can talk about specific things like shooting at cars, or we can talk about specific things like use of force being evaluated, where they've taken stands and spent money to block and restrict changes. Even for my own self and my agency, which is again why I don't want to get into a whole debate with the POA, because I have specific examples and I'm not going to let someone articulate or mischaracterize what my role has been or what their role has been. Every single one of my major prosecutions has not only been fought in ways that I would not say have been helpful to reforms, but have been elevated at an exhaustive and expensive way throughout appellate and superior court challenges as well. which, you know, it's a government agency, and I'm, you know, I have my own legal team to fight to get through what I know needs to get done. My concern is other agencies that are less well-funded, that don't have the resources that I have at my disposal, and that don't have the benefit of my legal knowledge and experiences from running a city or running a major legal office in the past to know how to address, fight, and move an agenda and a ball forward because of their really, really aggressive tactics in fighting not just discipline, but policy reforms as well. And I think that's part of the problem. But I think part of the solution is, because you're not going to change that. And to the degree those are First Amendment rights, okay, let's approach it differently, right? We're not going to be able to marginalize how they spend their money discretionarily. We are able to address the broader population of officers who have a much better intent to say, how are your tax dollars being spent, and why aren't you playing a more active role? To the degree there's a defund the police movement going on externally, what are you doing internally to address the problem, to make sure that there are changes that are coming, and how is that going to work? I will say, even for myself, you know, I came over into this position and the union was, you know, not disappointed to see me take over this position, but immediately, as soon as I got here and started doing this work and making changes, because we never really finished the OCC transition to DPA, but in making changes and exercising my authority to do the job and clean up many of the transgressions that had happened in the past, you know, there's a whole funded newsletter that comes out in a newspaper that gets delivered everywhere every single month, that where I am excoriated every month with foolishness that I don't get to respond to, right? And the tactics that I think the union uses beyond their dollars and beyond their influence is something that we should be talking about, and that they're real things, right? This is part of the problem. No one is celebrating and clapping for the union representation because of not just how the dollars are spent, but because of the tactics that they use to quash or diminish reforms or efforts to make the departments more in line with what community demands are. And that, to me, is part of the problem.
So one of the points on the mayor's agenda for police reform was to have the DPA address police bias by, you know, performing audits and promoting bias exams to vet the police officers and sheriffs. But it's my understanding that the DPA already performs a lot of these functions. So I was just wondering if you could speak to any of the nuances that the mayor had in mind, and also explain a little more about the processes that DPA has in place now.
Okay, so yes and no, right? I hate to give you the legal answers, like it depends. So generally, we perform an audit function. I think what the mayor is talking about, and I have a meeting with her scheduled tomorrow to go into the weeds of defining what it is. I think if you look at the press announcement, which I have right here, and I'll send this to Art, so if you guys want to look at it, but her announcement, again, it's from a 5,000-foot level, talking about aspirational goals related to reform that budgets are going to be used for. But, you know, I hear that, and my response to this, which is why she was just calling, was a whole detailed outline of like, here's what an auditor costs, here's what the lawyer cost is, here's what the statistician is, here's that direct access to information that it needs. Like, I am good with the execution. Let me frame it out and build it out for you for what that's going to look like. And I'm not quite sure where she's going to land. But one of the issues that I think is really important about it is that focus on the pattern and practice evaluation has been and should have been the role from the federal government. The fact that it's not there, the bad candy's over there, the good candy's in there. The fact that, oh, that's cheap, that's a Carlos, that's the Dollar Tree candy. The fact that that they are shifting in focus and they want this analysis at a local level, I think is really important, but it's also not inexpensive, right? And it's also, I can't approach a pattern and practice evaluation and a full audit with my hands handcuffed with information and access from the department that they are unwilling to share or give me for whatever reasons, right? And so theoretically, I can come up with a policy provision, a policy analysis that includes evidence-based outcomes, but that evidence-based outcome is based on, it's only as good as the data. My data is specifically tied and correlated to complaints that come to my office, because that's what I know and that's what I see. But there's a whole universe of complaints that exist internally from internal affairs, and that exist in a whole nother universe of complaints that go to the department that they're supposed to turn over to me. And those are the areas that aren't connected to our collection. And these are questions that hadn't been raised before with OCC for whatever reasons. But, you know, like I said, law school teaches you very many things. Being a trial attorney teaches you very many things. So I'm not going to get caught with my pants down submitting a report after 2 years of work that's going to be invalidated because it didn't follow standard professional rules about data collection, because I didn't have access to the entirety of what exists in the universe. And that is a no-cost solution. So if you want me to do pattern and practice, which I can do, but isn't my job, that is something that could be part of what either the state AG does or part of what the federal government is doing. There's a cost to that that may be significant that I could cobble together with some use of the controller's office and some of their staff, but we have to get into the weeds to figure that out. But it's not a simple thing. It's a complex and a difficult thing to have a data analysis that speaks to pattern and practice. And this is before you even get to me prosecuting the cases, right? I'm still building out the foundation of what the cases are. So there's not a built-in defense at the end of it of that this data is incorrect and you can't prove and show pattern and practice because you're only talking about individual behavior. And again, that to me is the Achilles heel of all of this, is that I don't want to end up with community feeling like we've heightened more of the individual transgressions and of the individual prosecutions that's not tied to bigger outcomes and broader outcomes, which is why the pattern and practice stuff is so important. But it needs to be a broad approach that is both local, but speaks to state reform and federal reform. And I don't think we will get to the federal reform until we have a change in terms of the approach of what we want to do. And I will say, if you want to follow and track some of that stuff, because I'm sure you all read my stuff on politico.com, but if you track the stuff that's going on from the JIPA bill, the Justice and Policing Act, the difference is the Republicans are now saying that they're going to introduce their own act in their own bill. And I would say, I don't even need to look at it. I just responded to something in the Washington Examiner on this. But if you look, you can just, whatever they release, the question to ask is, does it include data collection, data analysis, with the goal being race neutral outcomes? And that's going to be coming over the next few weeks. So that's what you should be looking for. I can't imagine that I won't be doing TV on that as well. But that's going to be the key. I already know the direction that it's going in. It's going to be a whole lot of aspirational goals of like, and we will have justice in policing. Well, okay, that I'm no longer eating what you're feeding me. Tell me what justice and policing means. Show me your data collection. Show me the transparency in that data so that any community can test, observe, and review what you're doing and how you're doing it. And then show me your analysis of that data that is tied both to and here's the answer, your data analysis tied to policy provisions and training that give us race neutral outcomes, right? It's not enough just to recognize, and we have a problem. Girl, we knew we had a problem before you came in the room. Your acknowledging it is not part of the solution. It is part of the perpetuation of the problem because you think that that's letting some of the air out of the balloon, and it's not. We have to push these conversations, and we can only push these conversations when we are informed so that we know what to ask for and we know what to say. And if it can't be us, then it's our advocates and our allies that we are informing because we've learned it, we know it, and we can tell them what to say, and we can send those letters into Congress. We can demand that our public defenders and our prosecutors are saying and asking this. We are demanding that our Senate representatives, our congressional representatives are asking this, that our president is asking this. And I mean, that's where the power is. It's the conversations like this where we walk away empowered to really understand, even without the specifics, but in a more general way, what the solution has to be in order to get us to a changed outcome from policing and public safety.
So it's really nice to see you. Thank you so much for your words today. It's great to get to see you again. And sort of inspired by that and my bias on that front, and some of the comments that you've made today with respect to your work as in the district attorney's office, and also more generally the work that prosecutors can do. I guess I was wondering, thinking of the local government as a shared enterprise that can involve not just a mayor or a city council or a board of supervisors, but also an elected district attorney. What is the role of, what should the role of the district attorney be? Maybe even beyond, we're seeing, of course, in the news, charging decisions against officers, and that's obviously a very important role. So what role, there's that role. Are there other roles that the district attorney's office should be playing to achieve the goals that you've been talking about today?
100%. And again, this is something that's quite in my comfort zone. I was in the district attorney's office and I was a prosecutor for a long period of time. And I saw many of those things and many of the problems and challenges, because I think the district attorney's office perpetuates a lot of these challenges that we have in terms of race disparities, right? They are part of the system that gets us to these outcomes. And I will say, you know, I no longer think that these systemic problems are coincidental, right? I think the decisions that get made from a prosecution's perspective disproportionately impact communities of color because no one is changing them. But there's a reason why no one is changing them, right? It's easier to show up and say that you are following directions and do what you're supposed to do than it is to do something else. And I will say, if you look at most of these agencies, and San Francisco is an exception, not the rule, the agencies for folks like you and I that have gone to law school that are looking for work, most of these government type agencies don't pay the same things that private industry pays. And so to the degree you want to make a change and you want to be part of the active role from either the public defender's office or the district attorney's office, I think it's a harder decision to make if you have to balance economics. And I bring up economics because there is no way to separate socio-economics from race. And so when you have positions that require or need change from within, and those positions pay below market rate for positions, it's harder to say that you're going to have an inclusionary agenda or a diverse agenda. And I don't ever make any apologies about my intentionality as it relates to diversity and inclusion. And so for prosecution, I remember I didn't do that great in law school, but I am good on the interview. So I had a number of really good job offers. One of the ones that stand out, and I like to give this example, was to become, and really, I had such a stupid and stupidly informed approach to this. I just chose cities that I thought it would be fun to live in because I saw them on TV. I know, so stupid, but I'm just being honest with you. So my list was New York, LA, San Francisco, Miami, and Chicago. That's before I'd gone and done a winter in Chicago, so I didn't know. It just looked beautiful because they tricked me because I went there one summer. Anyway, but I had a job offer from Miami to be a DA in South Beach, Dade County. Woo! I was so excited. But that position paid $20-something thousand a year. It was like, is this candid camera? Is this like a joke for TV? Like, who is taking those jobs? They had a whole system where their incoming classes had priority to get part-time jobs at Nordstrom to sustain themselves if they wanted to. And I only bring up that example to identify the folks that took those jobs and some of these most conservative areas, the individuals that are allowed to take those jobs that are hugely important and powerful in terms of decision making tend to be older, white, independently wealthy men in those positions. And that is not something that, I think it's not an accident when we look back and we say like, well, why isn't there more diversity? Why isn't there more inclusion? But even in the cities that there is more of a financial benefit to come and doing that work, like in San Francisco, when I came to San Francisco and I grew up here, I was the first African-American that the office had hired in 5 years. 5 years, no paralegals, no interns, no secretaries, nothing. That's a problem. We have to talk about that. We have to have seats at the table for broader communities in order to make sure that we have better outcomes for the policies that we're drafting and implementing. And so one of the things that I identified, like within my first 3 weeks of being in the office, was we have a different standard. We have a standard for imposing 3 strikes that is not race neutral. And I think we have a problem. Now, obviously, my mother is a public defender, and if you ask her, she will tell you that I came to San Francisco to be a DA just to shame her and make her feel bad about herself and her life choices. But that's not the case. But raising the issues that I saw from having the exposure to the work, seeing how the decisions got made, I didn't know that it would change things. It did, but I wrote a memo to the elected DA just telling them like, hey, I don't know if you know or you're aware, but there's a non-race neutral outcome happening because of what's going on and how you evaluate and how you make decisions about 3 strikes. But if I didn't say it, I don't know that it would have changed. And it did change. But, I think stuff like that comes up all the time, but you have to point them out. You have to be looking for those things in order to try and make a change, just like the diversity. I just started bringing resumes to the office because most offices will tell you this. When you challenge them and you push them on their hiring practices, anyone can apply here. Yes, that is not the question. Anyone can, but not everyone does. And to the degree you allow that process to perpetuate itself, you are adopting a systematic process that is discriminatory for broader communities. Talk to me about your intentionality that didn't get met, and now we'll have a conversation. But you don't get to tell me that, well, we tried because we're just open. And that's what most prosecution offices will tell you on why they don't have diversity. And it's part of the reason why the same thing with law enforcement. Law enforcement agencies will tell you the same thing. We always want to hire women. We don't have any. We would have promoted women, but they didn't apply for the promotion. They didn't fill out an application to come here. I just think that we are too informed and too evolved now to accept those challenges. And I want from prosecution the same things that I want from law enforcement, to try and take objective looks at what their behaviors are and what their standards are and apply them to race neutral outcomes to justify what they're doing, rather than their anecdotal, like, there's no hate in my heart. I come to work every day and I'm open. I just look at the police reports and make decisions. You don't have that luxury, because you're faced with these statistics that show you that there are systematic problems. So how are you going to address that? I think we have to ask those questions, and that doesn't mean that we have to go and picket and yell and throw a Molotov cocktail at our boss, but it does mean that we are empowered with our voices, we are empowered with our education, and we are empowered with the privilege of our positions that we are in. And what you choose to do with that privilege is self-determining in terms of the evaluations that we have for ourselves. and my judgment. So I will judge you for not following up and making a change and making a difference.
I cannot thank you enough. I can see how these conversations could go on and on and on, but on behalf of the Rennie Public Law Group, thank you. We owe you. If you need anything, let us know. This has been a great conversation, and I hope we can do it again.